The next session, the next presenter is Venerable Thubten Chodron from United States. I do not know the exact location, but the flight was delayed for 2 hours yesterday. The temple she's staying in Sravasti Abbey. You all know that what is Sravasti. There are many Western factions in the monastery. The title of the presentation is Western Buddhist Nuns in the Tibetan Tradition, Past, Present, and Future. Venerable Somo discussed the situations in the Himalaya region, but Venerable Chodron will discuss the situation in the United States of Western.
Please go ahead. Yes.
Okay, Amitofo. It's really quite a delight for me to be here. I was very honored and actually surprised to receive the invitation. And as someone whose main work, in addition to Dharma practice, is helping to establish Buddhism in Western countries, it's always so inspiring to come to Asia and see how Asians practice and reconnect with the roots here, which are so valuable and so necessary, that connection to transmit Buddhism into new countries in a pure manner. I watched one of Venerable Daehaeng's Dharma talks on the web, and I especially liked her way of explaining the Dharma in an easy way that was practical, that people could really understand and implement in their life. And I think this is so important for all of us to do. Also, I want to thank Venerable Yeshe Somo for giving about a third of my Dharma, a third of my talk, in the sense that my subject is to talk about Buddhist, Western Buddhist women who ordain in the Tibetan tradition. And to do that, I was going to give a brief summary of the situation of women in the past and present in Tibet and the Himalayan countries. But you did a fantastic job, thank you. So I'll skip some things and emphasize others. So recently I was asked to give a talk at an American university, and one of the students there raised her hand and she said, "What is it like to be a Buddhist nun?" And I just spontaneously said, "It's wonderful. You know, you have so much freedom. You can do so much in your life as a nun." And I really deeply feel that and feel very privileged to have been able to take not only the Shramaneri novice ordination, but I was one of those following her advice to go to Taiwan and receive the Bhikshuni ordination. Okay, so the situation of Westerners meeting the Tibetan Dharma, Tibetan Buddhism, in one way you could see it as rather comical, because this mostly happened it started in the 60s, and then increased in the 70s. And both Venerable Somo and I came along in the 70s. And this was the culture of the hippies. And I don't know how much you know about our generation, but we both were typical of it. And this is kind of the opposite of the way Buddhist monastics live and the way they think. So it was really interesting to see these people coming to hear the Dharma and learn about ethical conduct and discipline in your life from Tibetan lamas who were celibate. Most of the Westerners who came were not. So it was a real cultural encounter, together with different languages. In the situation in India, as was mentioned, many people got sick. We had incredible visa problems. You would start studying a text, then your visa ran out. You had to go to another place to get it renewed and come back. Okay. A little bit about my own background. I encountered the Dharma in 1975. I took the novice shamanary ordination in 77 and mostly studied in India and in Nepal. My teacher then started sending students out to work in Dharma centers. So I wound up in Europe. Dharma centers at that time and still now are meant for lay practitioners. So the Sangha acts as staff and sometimes leading meditations or whatever. But the education program is not designed for the monastics in the Dharma centers. And the culture in the Dharma centers, where you have lay people who have relationships, who sing and dance, who handle money and so on, it makes it a very different environment than living in a monastery. We couldn't really stay in the Tibetan monasteries. As Venerable mentioned, the monks' educational institutes and monasteries would not accept women, and there were very few nunneries at that time. And the ones that existed in the 70s, they mostly did rituals. They had basic education, but were very much for rituals. And also, then this makes a big difference in terms of Westerners going to other Buddhist traditions, for example, in Korean Buddhism, Chinese Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, because the Tibetans were refugees. Yeah, the rest of the Asian traditions, they had their own countries, their own governments. The institutions, the Buddhist institutions, had been stable in the country for a long time. The Tibetans became refugees in '59 after an abortive uprising against the occupying Chinese communists. And so they were in India, and they were impoverished. They were trying to just set up their own monasteries and stay alive. Yeah, so they were very willing to teach Westerners, yeah, to share the Dharma. But in terms of starting monasteries, no, because their main emphasis was to reestablish their own monasteries in India. And then, of course, the nunneries started as well. By the way, when I say monasteries, I use this term for both where men live and women live, either one. I use the term monastery, because in English the term nunnery or convent has a very strange implication. Anyway, okay. so we walked into this environment, and the lamas didn't know what to make of us. And it's no wonder, because Tibet had had very little contact with other countries in the interval. And then here come all these Westerners with long hair, strange clothes, very colorful. Some are clean, some are dirty, and they sit and listen to teachings, and then they say to the teachers, Lama, what do you think of taking drugs when you meditate? It would make your meditation so vivid. Yeah, the lamas are going, what in the world are you guys talking about? Yeah, so you can imagine the kind of situation it was. And of course, they had very little experience with women, and this was exactly the time of the women's lib movement in the West, and so the women are coming in and we're saying, okay, where's our place? We don't see any female role models. Yeah, there are no bhikshunis. There were maybe 1 or 2 women who taught, but those women were always relatives of the very famous and men who were monks or lay lamas. So we had no role models, and we thought men and women are equal. And our teachers are kind of like, again, like, what are these people talking about? Yeah, it was so much cultural difference. Okay, so there were the pioneering Western nuns. The first one was Venerable Kecha Palma, who was British, and she married an Indian and lived in India for a while. And she decided to become a nun. And her teacher was very, very supportive. So she wound up establishing the first Tibetan nunnery in exile, Tilakpur Nunnery. And she also established a school for incarnate lamas. Okay, and she received her novice ordination from Gyawa Kamarpa in the photo, and then went to Hong Kong in 1972 to become the first bhikshuni in the modern era in the Tibetan tradition. Following her were Venerable Daehaeng Chodron, who was a Westerner, American photojournalist, and she ordained in 1977, and she also helped to establish her teacher's monastery in Nepal. And then my teachers, Lama Thubten Yeshe and Lama Zopa Rinpoche, they had established Kopan Monastery for the young Sherpa monks. The Sherpas are Himalaya people. And Westerners started to go there, so we lived kind of side by side with all the little monks. Yeah, and they really did their best to try and understand Westerners. One of their first Western students was Zina Rachevsky, who was said to be a Russian-American princess. But anyway, she requested the lamas to teach, and Max Matthews and Annie LaAnne, 2 other Western women, one Canadian and one American, joined them. And so they really focused on helping Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa establish the monastery for the little Sherpa monks. Okay. In terms of the Westerners, we lived, at Kopan, and then when we got kicked out because our visa has expired, we went to India and, lived together there in these mud brick buildings known as the Injigompa. Okay, and it was there that I first met Venerable Somo and had many long discussions with her, and she told me, you must go to Taiwan and become a bhikshuni. And I put up no resistance. I was all for that. Our teachers, when the Western nuns had asked about that, they said the same things to us as they do say to the Tibetan and Himalayan nuns, which is you already have the Shramaneri precepts, you have the Bodhisattva precepts, the Tantric precepts. There's no necessity for you to become bhikshunis. Of course, that avoids asking the question why it's important for the men to become bhikshus. But, we were told that, and the Tibetan and Himalayan nuns, because it was said by their teachers, accepted that, and that fits in with their culture. As far as Western nuns, many of them accepted what the Tibetan teachers said about that, but there were a small number of us, still very small, who went to Taiwan, some to Korea or Hong Kong or where other places to receive the bhikshuni ordination in the Dharmaguptaka Vinaya tradition. Okay, so as I mentioned before, when Westerners asked the lamas to establish centers in Western countries, they did that, and the Western Sangha was sent there to staff the places. Most of us as Westerners, we were very poor. The Tibetans, poor in the sense that we were young. We did not have savings. Many of us had just finished college or finished high school, started traveling. We did not have big bank accounts. And yet, coming into the refugee community, they depended on us to make offerings, to help out. But it put a strain on the Western monastics ourselves because we were living in India with very little money. And it was really a challenge sometimes. So there was a lot of difficulties, language, illness, visa, and not having much money and not even having a ticket to go back to our own country. It was difficult, but looking back on those years, I very much appreciated the difficulty because it made me, it gives a certain strength. Yeah, when you face difficulty, you have to be very sure of what you're doing, very certain of what you're doing, because if you say, the conditions are too difficult, it's better to go back to lay life, you can practice as a lay person, then your ordination is gone. And that actually happens to many of the Western, both men and women. Okay, and like I said, our teachers' emphasis was not on us, it was on establishing their own communities in exile, and that makes sense, that's completely fitting. Okay, so, but the Buddha said that if you practice sincerely, then you would not starve. So I was young, naive, and had great faith, and I said, okay, I'm poor, so be it. I'm going to continue, and I'm going to practice. Okay? Another interesting thing that happens with Western people who are ordained in the Tibetan tradition is that when we come back to the West, people have no idea who we are. Okay? We walk on the street in our robes, and they say Hare Krishna. I go in a woman's bathroom in an airport, and other women come in, and they go, oh! Because they think I'm a man, because I have a shaved head. People come up to me in public places, usually a woman, they put a hand on my shoulder, and say, don't worry, dear, after the chemo is finished, your hair will grow back. Yeah, so people have no idea in the world who we are, okay, and what we're trying to do. And so they would, in supporting, they would support the Tibetan monks, yeah, first, some the Tibetan and Himalayan nuns, okay, then the Western monks, and then sometimes us. Okay? And that was just the reality of the situation. But like I say, difficulties, they make you strong, especially when you know, growing up in America, I never had financial problems, you know. I had kind parents who supported me through school. Okay, so language was a big issue. Our teachers mostly spoke Tibetan. We did not. They did not know how to teach Tibetan in those days because they hadn't had contact with Westerners who wanted to learn their language. Okay. And we didn't have books to read. One of the first books I read was by Lobsang Rampa, who turned out to be an Irish plumber, not a Buddhist monk, who wrote all about magic in Tibet. You know, completely some kind of fantasy what he wrote, but that's what many people read and thought Tibetan Buddhism was about. Okay, so in the West, you know, people, when I go to speak in colleges, sometimes people will ask me, do you do magic? Yeah, or really, or if I'm in Singapore or, you know, Theravada countries, sometimes people will say, oh, you practice Tibetan Buddhism? I hear those people have sex and drink, even though they're monastics. And I have to go, no, that's not really the case. If somebody does that, they're breaking their root precepts and they're no longer a monastic. Okay, so there's all sorts of misconceptions about Tibetan Buddhism that we have to somehow do our best to straighten out, because all of the traditions go back to the Buddha, and Tibetan practice is very much based on the Four Truths and the Eightfold Noble Path and so on. You know, the teachings on compassion, the teachings on wisdom. They are not a separate kind of Buddhism unrelated to the other traditions at all. Okay, so one of the difficulties that Western nuns faced, in addition to the ones I just mentioned, was, you know, there were no nunneries. And when people talked about establishing the monasteries or abbeys, we chose to use the word abbey instead of monastery or nunnery. Some of us did. There was no model for it at all. And our families were not Buddhist, okay? So some of us had a lot of difficulty in terms of family relationships, because being Westerners and also being women, you know, our prescribed role from our family and from society was you get married, you have children, and now, you know, since I came along in the generation, the feminists, now you can also have a career, yeah, and yeah. But they never thought of people like us who wanted to be celibate and be monastics, okay? So, and then also from the side of the nuns, you know, so not all of the problems came from outside. Yeah, some of the problems came from the mentality of the Western nuns. Westerners are very individualistic, yeah? They did not want to give up what you have to give up to live in a community. So although people said we don't have support, when it was suggested form a community, nobody was, not nobody, but most of the other nuns were not enthusiastic about the idea. I was, because I had some experience living in a community of nuns, and I just saw the benefit of it, and the Buddha himself set up the Sangha as living communities, not as individuals who just did their own thing. But getting that across to people who had to be very individualistic to start with, because in our culture there was no models of people, becoming Buddhist nuns. That was a bit challenging. I think monastic life is quite important. You don't get the same benefit living on your own. There are many Western nuns who get ordained, and then you're expected to support yourself. Yeah, so you get ordained, then you have to support yourself. So many of them go to work. If you go to work to have a job, you have to put on lay clothes, let your hair grow a little bit. You have your own apartment with a TV. You have to have a car to get to work. And your lifestyle becomes not terribly different than it was before, except you go to the Dharma Center in the evenings and join the programs there. Like I said, I made a determination not to work for money, and so I dealt with the ramifications of that. But I always had in my heart, I really want to set something up so that the future generations of Western women wouldn't have to undergo the same kind of challenges that those of us in the early years underwent. The Buddhist monastics conferences, were a way that for us to connect with other traditions. So we were able to meet with other Asian traditions, and we also started having monastic conferences in the West with Western monastics, meaning anybody, whatever race you were, who was living in the West could come to those. And they were very inspiring. And in establishing Sravasti Abbey, I relied a lot on the knowledge of the Theravada and Zen abbesses and abbots that I met in listening to their advice about how to set things up. In 1996, we had a program for nuns in Dharamsala called Life as a Western Buddhist Nun, and Venerable Wu Yin from Taiwan, who is a Bhikshuni master, came and taught there, as well as one Tibetan Lama. In 1993, we had the first Western Buddhist monastic conference in the U.S., again, a gathering place for us. And in 2018, Sravasti Abbey, the monastery or abbey where I live, hosted another program for nuns. Okay. What else? So things have improved for the Western, Westerners who want to ordain. Now there are pre-ordination programs. When I came along, there was very little screening. So, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, even today, some people who have mental problems are allowed to ordain because the Tibetan monks are the ones who decide who ordains and who doesn't, and they can't speak the language, so they can't tell who is mentally sound and who isn't. So that's one difficulty. Okay. And then also, you're supposed to do things kind of, your teacher guides you and tells you what to do. And it wasn't really encouraged to go and start your own thing, yeah? So Venerable Lakshisomo and I are kind of oddballs, would you say? Because both of us have gone out and started our own projects. My teachers approve. I went to His Holiness the Dalai Lama and received his approval for starting the Abbey, so that was no problem. What else? As you can see, I am not following exactly what I wrote, but this is my style. I like to speak extemporaneously and not read a paper. Okay. Where was I? 6. Okay. So the opportunities have increased for Western nuns now, but still difficult. And part of the difficulty, like I said, is in the mentality of the Western nuns who feel that they should just follow their teachers, and if their teachers send them to Dharma centers, do that. And of course, that's very virtuous. But to have a place where you live, and you live as a community, not just as a boarding house for monastics, is a totally different thing, creating that community feeling. Okay, so I had that dream of doing that, but of course I didn't have any confidence. I tried to work with some other people to do it together, and all my other friends had things that they were already doing, projects they were engaging in. So at one point, I just decided to go it alone. Actually, one thing that gave the space for that was in 1993, there was a conference of Western Buddhist teachers with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and some of us presented a panel on Western monastics. And after Jitsu Tenzin Palmo's presentation about the situation, His Holiness began to cry. And the room was completely silent, because he saw that here there were people with sincere motivations who wanted to practice the Dharma and attain awakening, but faced so many obstacles, especially as monastics. And then he said to us, don't wait for us Tibetan lamas to do things for you. You know your own culture. You can go and set up things yourself. So for me, that was all I needed, was His Holiness' permission and to go and start something. So in starting Sravasti Abbey, I did not have any organization behind me, no big sponsors. I kind of just started. I had been teaching in the US for some years, so there were some lay people who wanted to help out. And we got some land in Washington State, so that's in the northwest part of the US. It's out in the countryside. We're about 20 minutes from a one-stoplight town, and about an hour and 15 minutes from a proper city. When we started the Abbey, I very much wanted to go back to some of the ways that the Buddha actually set up the Sangha. We're in a rural area without many Buddhists nearby, so it wasn't the proper place to go on Pindapat and collect alms. And it wasn't also suitable to ask the lay people to cook the food and bring it to us. So what I did is I said, we are not going to buy any of our food, and we will live only on the food that people offer to us. And when I said that, then the lay people who were helping me said, "You're going to starve. There's no way in America people are going to go up and offer food." But I said, let's try it. Okay. So there, in the early years, there came one time when the refrigerator was empty, but there were still some canned goods in the cupboard. And then it really involved an education process, teaching the Western lay people what is the relationship between the Sangha and the laity, and that the Sangha's job is to practice, to hold the teachings, to give the teachings, to do spiritual counseling, to establish a place where people in society know that they can go when they're having difficulties, a place they know that there are people who are meditating on love, compassion, joy, and equanimity, people who are trying to develop wisdom and generosity and overcome their self-centeredness. So just knowing that there's that kind of place in America inspires many people. And so slowly, we've been receiving the support, and we have been able to build the initial land that we had a house on it, and anyway, forget the slides. It had a house on it and a garage, and so we had to start converting those. Then we built a residence for the nuns, and had to build the kitchen and some more guest rooms. And now we want to build a Buddha hall, okay, which will, because our meditation hall is too small. And all of our facilities are too small right now. So that's our next project. Westerners come, and like I said, Westerners are not only Caucasian, they're African American, they're Asian, and many different descents. And so when people come, we teach them the Dharma. They start out with the 5 precepts. People who are interested in ordination can then take the 8 precepts, and they put on a blue kind of uniform and shave their head. But they are not monastics. We have them do that so they get used to wearing different clothes and having their head shaved. Okay. Okay, so they take the anagarika for about a year, and we really screen the people very carefully. For health, physical health, mental health. They live in the community as lay people first and as anagarikas for a year. So they get used to how we do things. And we see how receptive they are to the teachings. And if they want to be in a community and really function as a group of people who make decisions together, who do the Vinaya ceremonies together, who do Sangha karmas to make major decisions about the direction of the monastery. And so if they seem ready to do that, then they request to take the novice ordination, the Shramanera ordination. So our community is mostly women. We have 1 bhikshu, and we have 3 male anagarikas, almost. And some people said to me, "Why are you accepting males there? This should be just for women." And the thing is, I said, I have male students because I've been teaching for a while, and I don't want to discriminate against them and to have them face the same kind of impediments that I faced as a woman joining Tibetan Buddhism. And so we allow the men to come, and some of them are starting to ordain now. So when people get the Shramaneri or Shramanera ordination, for the one for the women, we give at the Abbey, so the women get the Shramaneri and the Shikshamana ordination on the same day. They keep that for 2 years. The men only get the Shramanera, but they keep that for 2 years. And then, because we're really making it gender equal. And so then after 2 years, they can request full ordination. And so people generally go to Taiwan to do that. And, the 1 month program and everything. So there's different challenges with that, but I think it's also very, very good for people's minds. Our real hope and dream is to have the full ordination at the Abbey. Okay, like I said, we do the novice ordination and the shikshamana for women. We do the ceremony in English. Our dream is to be able to ordain Western, both monks and nuns, in an English ceremony. And we use the Dharma-Guptaka tradition, the same as you have here in Korea, because of all the difficulties with establishing bhikshuni ordination in the Tibetan tradition, as Venerable Lakshe explains so well. Okay, so now we have 12 bhikshunis, 1 bhikshu. We have 7 shikshamanas. Several of our nuns have been waiting to take bhikshuni ordination, but because of COVID, they have not been able to go to Taiwan to do that. But hopefully they will soon. Okay, so the Abbey is not set up. We are not trying to duplicate the Tibetan education system and the Tibetan monastic system, because it's a totally different culture. We want to bring the pure Dharma teachings over to the West, but adapt it to our culture. And so that's a major project that we are engaged in. Our nuns do prison work, and we send Dharma materials out to prisons. We are involved in the local community, helping the youth emergency services that help at-risk children. We go out and speak in different places wherever people invite us to speak. And we have established a study program really that we teach the same texts as the Tibetans do, but we really emphasize practice. So we don't do the debating like they do. We have a form of discussion, but really emphasizing community life as the way in which you put the Dharma to practice. Because you can study a lot about compassion, but when you live with a lot of people and you have to make decisions together, and there's a schedule to follow that you have to follow whether you like it or not, then you have to really work with your mind, and you have to put the teachings into practice. And so we really emphasize that. So I'd like to invite you all to come to Sravasti Abbey and see what we're doing and contribute your wisdom that you have gained through centuries of practicing the Dharma here in Korea.
감사합니다. Thank you for the inspiring presentation.